I was in the ICU for 11 days before they moved me to a regular room, and not one person from my family called to ask how I was doing. Not my daughter Simone. Not my son-in-law Brett. Not my sister Lorraine, who lives 40 minutes away in Barrie and who I had driven to her chemotherapy appointments every single Tuesday for 8 months 2 years prior. Not my mother, who is 81 and sharp as a tack and perfectly capable of picking up a phone. 11 days in the ICU. Then another 3 weeks recovering in a step-down unit at Sunnybrook. 32 days total. 32 days where the only person who sat beside my bed, who held my hand when the pain was so bad I couldn't speak, who brought me real food from the Lebanese place on Yonge Street, because hospital food was making me miserable, was my friend Colette, who I have known since we were both 26 years old and working the same insurance office in downtown Toronto. Colette, who is not related to me by blood, who had no obligation, who drove 45 minutes each way twice a week, the entire time I was in that hospital, even when there was freezing rain and the 401 was a parking lot. My family? Nothing. I want to be clear about something before I tell you the rest of this story. I am 54 years old. I am not a dramatic person. I do not catastrophize. I have been through a divorce, 2 rounds of layoffs, a breast cancer scare that turned out to be nothing, and the death of my father. All without falling apart publicly or making anyone feel obligated to rally around me. I am the kind of woman who says I'm fine and means it most of the time, and who genuinely does not enjoy being a burden to anyone. So when I tell you that what my family did, or rather what they didn't do, during those 32 days broke something in me, I need you to understand that I am not being dramatic. I am telling you exactly what happened. It started on a Wednesday in February. I had been feeling off for about a week, nothing specific. Just a kind of heavy exhaustion that I kept chalking up to the weather, to the gray slog of a Toronto February, to the fact that I had been working long hours trying to close out a project before the end of the quarter. I was a project manager for a mid-sized logistics company. I was used to pushing through. That Wednesday morning I woke up and something was wrong. A pressure in my chest that I had never felt before. Not sharp, not dramatic the way they show it in movies. Just this relentless grinding weight, like someone had placed a very heavy book directly on my sternum and left it there. I sat up in bed and waited to see if it would pass. It didn't. I called Colette because she lives 4 blocks away, and because I didn't want to call 911 if it was nothing. I said, I think something might be wrong with me. She was at my door in 6 minutes. She took one look at me sitting on the edge of my bed, gray-faced and sweating in a cold February apartment, and she called 911 herself without asking me. Colette rode in the ambulance with me. She stayed in the waiting room for 4 hours while they figured out what was happening. What was happening, it turned out, was that I had had a heart attack. A STEMI, a blockage in one of the major arteries. The cardiologist explained it to me later. Using diagrams I couldn't really focus on, because I was still processing the word heart attack, and trying to reconcile it with my self-image as someone who walked 30 minutes every morning, and ate reasonably well, and was 54, not 74. They did an emergency procedure that night. When I came out of it, groggy and terrified and hooked up to more machines than I could count, the face I saw when I opened my eyes was Colette's. She had not left. I asked her later, when I was more coherent. I asked if anyone had called. She hesitated just long enough that I already knew the answer before she said gently, I reached out to Simone. I left a message. One message. Colette left one message for my daughter, and that was apparently all the information Simone needed to decide that she did not need to come. I found out later, much later, after everything that I'm about to tell you, that Simone had told her husband Brett that it was probably not that serious, because I was the type to be fine. I want to sit with that for a moment. My daughter decided, without calling the hospital, without speaking to a doctor, without speaking to me, that my heart attack was probably not that serious because of a character assessment she had made about my general resilience. In the first week, I told myself there was an explanation. Simone and Brett were in the middle of renovating their house in Mississauga. They had a toddler, my grandson Owen, who was going through some kind of sleep regression. Life was genuinely complicated for them. I understood that. I am a reasonable person. I made excuses for them the way I had been making excuses for them for years without fully realizing that's what I was doing. My sister Lorraine called once, on day 4. She called my cell phone, which I had with me in the hospital room. The call lasted 6 minutes. I know because I looked at it afterward in my call log, the way you examine evidence after something goes wrong. 6 minutes. She asked how I was feeling. I told her it had been serious, that I'd had a procedure, that I was going to be there for a while. She said, "Oh wow, that's scary. Well, you rest up. You'll be fine, you're tough." And then she said she had to go because Declan's hockey game was starting. I stared at the phone for a long time after she hung up. My mother called on day 7. Also 6 minutes, coincidentally. She asked if the food was okay, told me a story about her neighbor's husband, who had had a heart attack 15 years ago and was now playing golf twice a week, and told me that she'd been praying for me. She did not suggest coming to visit. She lives with Lorraine. Lorraine has a car. Barry is 40 minutes away. Colette came every Tuesday and Thursday. She brought me real food, magazines, hand lotion because hospital air is so dry it makes your skin feel like paper. She watched 2 seasons of a show with me on her laptop propped on the tray table. She sat with me on the bad nights when I couldn't sleep, and we talked about everything and nothing. About the years we had known each other. About our 20s in that terrible office with the flickering fluorescent light above the photocopier. About what we wanted the rest of our lives to look like. On day 19 I cried. Not from the pain, not from the fear. I had been managing those things. I cried because it was a Sunday afternoon and the room was very quiet and I had not been visited by a single member of my family in 19 days, and the weight of that fact finally became too heavy to carry quietly. Colette held my hand and didn't say anything for a long time, which was exactly the right thing to do. I went home on a Thursday in mid-March. Colette drove me. She had already, without being asked, stocked my fridge with easy-to-prepare food and picked up my prescriptions. 5 new medications I would be taking for the foreseeable future. She had even put a sticky note on each bottle explaining what it was for, because she knew I had been given so much information in the hospital that some of it had stopped sticking. Simone called that evening. The first call in 32 days. She said, "Mom, I've been so worried about you." I did not say what I was thinking. I said, "I'm home now." She said, "We should come visit soon." I said, "Sure." We hung up. Nothing happened. No visit was scheduled. I spent the next several weeks doing what the cardiologist told me. I rested. I walked. Short distances at first, then longer. I took my medications. I went to my cardiac rehab appointments at hospital every Monday and Wednesday morning, where I did supervised exercise with a group of other people who had also had their lives interrupted by their own hearts deciding to malfunction. I found those sessions surprisingly comforting. There is something grounding about being in a room with other people who understand, without explanation, what it feels like to have your sense of your own body completely dismantled and rebuilt from scratch. I did not hear much from my family during those weeks. Lorraine texted a few times. My mother called on Easter Sunday. Simone and Brett brought Owen to visit once in April, 2 months after I had come home. They stayed for an hour and a half. Simone spent most of it on her phone and Brett spent most of it chasing Owen around my living room while I watched, exhausted and strangely detached, as though I was observing a scene from a documentary about someone else's life. I did not say any of what I was feeling. I made tea. I gave Owen the little wooden toy train I had bought him at a craft fair in the fall. Watched him play, and when they left, I sat in my quiet apartment for a very long time. I want to be precise about my emotional state during this period, because I think it matters. I was not devastated in the way I might have been at 30 or 40. I was not sobbing every night or consumed by bitterness. What I felt was something quieter and more final. A kind of settling. Like sediment in water that has finally stopped being disturbed. Things were becoming very clear to me about what my family was and what I was to them. And while that clarity was painful, it was also, in a way I hadn't expected, a relief. I had spent so many years performing a version of closeness with people who were not, in any meaningful sense, showing up for me. The heart attack had stripped away the performance and left only the truth. And the truth was simple. When I had needed them most, they had not come. I started making some decisions, quietly, over those spring and summer months. I updated my will, I changed my emergency contact from Simone to Colette. I spoke to my financial advisor about my estate planning, and made some adjustments that I had been putting off for years. I am a project manager by training and by temperament. When I need to reorganize something, I make a plan. And then, in September, 7 months after my heart attack, I received a text message from Simone. I had just come back from a walk along the waterfront. It was one of those September evenings that makes you feel, briefly, that everything might be okay. The lake flat and pewter-colored. The air finally cool enough after a hot summer to feel like a real breath. I sat down on a bench with my coffee and looked at my phone. The text was long. Simone is not typically a long text person. The length alone made me uneasy before I had read a single word. She wrote, so excited about a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. She and Brett had found their dream property, a house in Muskoka, on a lake 2 hours north of the city. They had been dreaming about it for years. Owen would grow up with the lake in his backyard. They had found the perfect place. The offer had been accepted. They were over the moon. And then, they were short on the down payment. The property required more than they had anticipated. They had already reached out to Brett's parents, who had contributed what they could. They were also applying for a bridge loan, but the timeline was tight. Could I help with $22,000? It would not be a gift, she wrote. It would be a loan. She would put it in writing. They would repay it within 5 years. She had already talked to a lawyer about drawing up a proper agreement. I sat on that bench by the lake for probably 15 minutes. Just reading the message again. The September light was doing something beautiful on the water, and I was barely seeing it. $22,000. From a woman who could not make a 45-minute drive to sit with her mother in an ICU. Who had decided, from the comfort of her home in Mississauga, that my heart attack was probably not that serious. I want to tell you about the version of me that existed before February. The version who would have read a message like this and felt a complicated mix of hurt and guilt and obligation. Who would have stayed up late running the numbers? Who would have called Colette to talk it through? Who might very possibly, after enough internal wrestling, have found a way to say yes, because she was my daughter, because Owen was my grandson, because I had always believed that family means you find a way. That version of me was gone. I did not respond to the text that day. I went home, made dinner, took my evening medications and watched the news. I slept very well. The next morning, I made myself a proper breakfast, eggs, toast, the good coffee, and I sat at my kitchen table and I typed out my response. I kept it very short. I wrote, "Hi Simone, congrats on the house. I'm not in a position to help financially right now. Wishing you and Brett all the best with it." And then I put my phone face down on the table and finished my breakfast. The response came within 4 minutes. I know because I checked. 4 minutes. She wrote that she was shocked, that she thought I would want to help, that this was for my grandson's future, that she hadn't realized things were so tight for me financially. Which stung, because I had not said anything about my finances being tight. I had simply said no. The assumption that no always means can't, rather than won't, is a particular kind of insult that I doubt Simone even recognized she was delivering. Then she called. I let it go to voicemail. The voicemail was 4 minutes and 30 seconds long, and her voice moved through several different emotional registers. Confusion, hurt, a kind of careful reasonableness that I recognized as the tone she used when she was trying to manage me. And finally, something closer to genuine distress. She said she didn't understand what had changed. She said she thought we were close. She said she really needed me right now. I sat with that last line for a long time. She really needed me right now. I thought about the ICU. I thought about day 1, day 7, day 19. I thought about the 6-minute phone call from Lorraine during Declan's hockey game. I thought about the Easter Sunday call from my mother. And the visit in April that lasted 90 minutes. And left me feeling more lonely than I had before they arrived. I thought about Colette and her sticky notes on my medication bottles. I called Simone back. I had decided, in those quiet weeks of recovery, that I was not going to be a person who silently absorbs things anymore. That was not a dramatic decision. It was simply a practical one, made by a woman who had been lying in a hospital room for 32 days with a lot of time to think. I had done enough quiet absorbing. Now I was going to be honest, I said. Simone, I love you, I want you to know that. But I need to say something that I should have said in March. She started to speak. I kept going. I told her that I had spent 32 days in Sunnybrook. I told her that I had had a heart attack, a serious one. The kind that requires emergency surgery. And that I had been alone for all of it except for Colette. I told her that no one in our family had come. Not once. Not for a cup of coffee, not for 20 minutes. Not even a bunch of grocery store flowers left at the nurse's station. I told her that I had lain in a hospital bed in the middle of a February night, scared in a way I had never been scared before. And the only person who came was someone I had met at work 30 years ago. There was a silence on the line. Then she said, "Mom, I didn't know it was that serious." I said very quietly, "You didn't know because you didn't ask." Another silence. "Longer," she said. "Brett thought. We thought you would tell us if you needed us to come," I said. "I was in the ICU, Simone. I had had heart surgery. I was on oxygen. Colette left you a message the first night. What I needed was for someone to come without being asked." I could hear her breathing. I could hear, in the quality of her silence, that something was shifting. Some calculation she had been running. Some comfortable story she had been telling herself about why things had gone the way they had. Was colliding with the version of events I was now describing. I do not know what she had told herself in the 7 months since February about why she had not come. I do not know what story Brett had helped her build. I only know that it was not the story I was telling her now. She said, "I'm so sorry, Mom." I said, "I know." She said, "I should have been there, I know that. I don't have a good reason. I think I was scared and I made it about that instead of about you, and that was wrong. I appreciated that. I want to be fair." The apology was real, I could hear it. Simone is not a cruel person. She is a person who, like most of us, tends to make herself the center of her own story, and who had looked at her mother's emergency and made a decision, probably without fully examining it, that it was more manageable from a distance. But here is the thing about apologies, and I say this as someone who has spent 54 years figuring out how relationships work. An apology explains the past. It does not change what was true. For 32 days, I had been alone. That was true before the apology. It was true after. And what would remain true, regardless of how many conversations we had, was that when the moment had come, the real moment, the moment that actually tests what you mean to someone, my daughter had not shown up. I said, "I accept your apology, and I hope we can find our way to something better. But I also need you to understand that I am not able to lend you $22,000. That is not going to change." She asked why, and I could hear that she was genuinely trying to understand rather than to pressure me. So I told her, as straightforwardly as I could. I told her that I had spent a great deal of the past 7 months thinking about what I could count on, and what I couldn't. About who had been there and who hadn't. About the life I had in front of me, which, after a heart attack at 54, you think about differently than you did before, and how I wanted to live it. And I had decided that I needed to prioritize differently going forward. My own security, my own peace, my own future, which was not guaranteed, which I now understood could be interrupted at any moment, and which I intended to protect. $22,000 was a significant portion of my emergency fund. Post-cardiac event, that fund was not optional. That fund was what stood between me and a crisis if something went wrong again. I was not in a position, financially, practically, or emotionally, to lend it to a family who had not been able to get in a car and drive to Sunnybrook. I said all of that out loud, and something about saying it out loud, all of it plainly without softening it, made me feel for the first time in a long time like myself. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's fair, just that, that's fair." We talked for another 20 minutes. It was not a comfortable conversation, but it was an honest one, and I valued it more than 100 comfortable ones would have been worth. We did not fix everything. You do not fix 32 days in a phone call, but we said true things to each other, and that matters. I did not lend her the money. Brett's parents ended up increasing their contribution, and they found a smaller property, still on water, still in cottage country, just not the dream house. Owen will still grow up with a lake. That part worked out. My relationship with Simone has been different since that conversation. Not dramatically, not in the way of movies where a single honest conversation resolves everything and the music swells. Differently in smaller ways. She calls more regularly now. When she calls, she asks how I am actually doing and waits for the actual answer. She brought Owen last month without Brett, just the two of them, and she stayed for 4 hours and we made pasta together, and talked the way we used to talk when she was younger, and I was the person she called first about everything. I do not know if we will ever fully close the distance that opened up in February. I think some distances, once they open, remain in some form. A scar, not a wound, but visible if you know to look. What I know is that I see my situation clearly now in a way I did not before. I see who came when it mattered. I saw Colette last week. We walked along the waterfront the same way we have been walking together for nearly 30 years. And we stopped at the same bench where I had read Simone's text message in September. And we drank our coffees and watched the lake. She asked how I was doing. Not the polite version of the question. The real version. The version she has been asking me since February, with her whole attention pointed at me, waiting for the true answer. I told her I was good, and I meant it. Lorraine called in October to complain about how expensive everything has gotten, and to ask if I had any frequent flyer points I wasn't using, because she and her husband wanted to go somewhere warm for March break. I listened for a while. Then I told her I didn't have any points to spare. She moved on to the next topic without missing a beat. My mother still calls on holidays and asks about the food. I still walk 30 minutes every morning. I take 5 medications at breakfast and 2 at night. I go to my cardiology follow-ups, and I eat well and I sleep enough, and I do not, if I can help it, absorb things quietly anymore. I had 32 days in a hospital room to figure out what my life actually looked like, stripped of everything I had been telling myself about it. And what I found, when all the noise was gone, was this. There was one person who came. One person who sat in a fluorescent-lit waiting room for 4 hours without being asked. One person who learned what STEMI meant so she could explain it to me again slowly, when I still couldn't make sense of it myself. Everything else I thought I had. I had been maintaining through effort and wishful thinking, and a great deal of quiet looking away. And I am done maintaining things that do not hold themselves up. I am 54 years old. I had a heart attack. I survived it. I am standing in my kitchen on a Tuesday morning with my coffee and my window full of November light, and the sense which I did not have before February, of knowing exactly where I stand, and exactly who stands with me.
That is enough.
That is, actually, more than enough.